So today we're going to talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad and Sunday school. A lot's been written about the Underground Railroad,
But not Sunday school.
an awful lot. And a lot's been written about the Sunday school. How many of you ever heard of Samuel Pepys? You read Pepys' Diary. Okay, you know what that is? So people keep history. You have historians that go back and study history, but there are people that keep history by diaries, letters. In fact, at our American Legion, we have one of our positions is a historian. I'm the historian there, and the historian's job is to keep the history of that year by taking pictures and keeping them for posterity, so you can go back to any individual year and see what happened this year and so forth. Well, another method of keeping history is by newspaper clippings, scrapbooks. Any of you had children, you have scrapbooks? Any of you kept scrapbooks when you were young? Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, let me tell you, I was born in Harrisburg in 1930. So next April 20th, I'm going to celebrate my 90th birthday.
Wow.
And so back in those days, along with reading comic books, we kept scrapbooks and a lot of things like that. Well, in Harrisburg, newspaper clippings, something that started, I understand it started, we don't know when it started, but I know it was prominent during the Civil War and afterwards, for people to clip things out of the newspaper and put them in a scrapbook and so forth. Now, there was a woman, anybody ever hear of Mrs. Malvina Spencer Ingram? No. In fact, she was the wife of Spencer Ingram. Spencer Ingram was a teacher, and this is not an African, this is a white couple. Spencer Ingram was a teacher in the Harrisburg school system. He became the county superintendent of the county schools. And of course, he had access to a lot of school books, so he kept old volume books. Well, his wife, Malvina, M-A-L-V-I-N-A, loved to clip newspaper clippings. She would clip them out and save them. And she indexed them. Now, at the Dauphin County Historical Society, and I know many of you have been there, and a lot of you know Ken Frew. Well, one of the best kept secrets in the Dauphin County Historical Society are the clippings of Mrs. Spencer Ingram. Because she has 54 school books full of clippings. And she indexed them. There's some on churches, obituaries, gardens, recipes, the things that interest her, sewing. And this is between the years probably 1847 to maybe, she died in 1897. And they gave all of her volumes of history to the Dauphin County Historical Society in 1904. So she has a lot of clippings, 54 volumes, indexed. And at one time, before we had all this technology that you could go on and Google things and whatnot, people used to come in and look at that because that was a source of newspaper clippings. And a lot of the clippings she had were from newspapers that aren't even on microfilm. Nobody has anywhere. But nobody looks at this much anymore. So a year or so ago, I was looking at the one she had on churches. And there was a clipping that said the history of the Sunday schools. And I looked at the bottom, and the author was, sometimes the clippings in the newspapers, people wrote things in and they'd have a name at the bottom. And sometimes it'd be a full name, and sometimes it'd be just initials like WHD, William Howard Day, or WBR, William B. Rutherford, and so forth. But this particular clipping had the name George H Imes. And that's right away, I struck my fancy because I know who George Hezekiah Imes is. George Hezekiah Imes is related to my good friend, Mary Braxton. And there's a lot of people know the Imes family. And as, sort of shaking your head, as I've been working on these, with Linwood Sloan on the 100 names, so let's take a little bit about Linwood Sloan's project, because this all connects. Linwood Sloan has a project of putting up statues on Juneteenth of 2020 in the Capitol grounds near the Irvis Building, a statue that had 4 figures, William Howard Day, Thomas Morris Chester, Jacob Compton, and Francis Harper. And the theme would be the 15th Amendment to the 19th Amendment, 1870 to 1920. And alongside that, there are 100 names that he had me select from Harrisburg that could relate to everything from the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 to 1920. So George Imes is one of the names in there. Now George Imes, Hezekiah Imes, was in the Civil War, he was in the 43rd USCT. He was born around 1847, but he went into the Civil War as a very young man. And after the war, he came to Harrisburg and was a teacher in the Harrisburg school system. Talking about 1866, 67. And then he went to Stilton, and he taught in the Stilton school system. You know, feeling from Stilton, maybe. He taught at the old hygienic school. Well, this clipping she has is 1886, and he's writing a history of the Sunday school in Harrisburg. And since he's African American, he's primarily writing about the African American Sunday school. So I looked through this article, and it was 1870, it was January the 20th, 1878. This is the article. I was going to read a little bit about it. So he mentions that the Presbyterians started a school in 1829. In succeeding years, it was joined by the AME and the AME Zion Church. And the Sunday school was taught by both white and black teachers, but was primarily for black students. Some of the prominent names mentioned were Mrs. Agnes Crane, these were teachers, Dr. William Rutherford, Dr. Pap Jones, Joseph Bustill, Randolph Kelker, Mrs. Agnes Kemp, Judge Mordecai Mckinney, Joseph Popel, Cassius Brown. Well, these are names that are well known. These are people that were in the Underground Railroad, Civil War. These are prominent people. So there I saw the connection between Sunday school. So I started looking at these people and their connection. Now going back a little bit, as I said, I was born here in 1930, so started Bose Building in 1936. Well, in 1941, when I was a 5th grader at Bose Elementary, an article appeared in the newspaper on Monday, August the 11th, 1941. Now, you know where the Dauphin County courthouse is. Now, everybody knows where it is now. Well, during this particular article, they were tearing down houses to build the courthouse, because the old courthouse was on Market Street. Well, they tore down the houses, and at 9 South Front was Rudolph Kelker's house. At 11 South Front was Dr. Rutherford's house. And when they tore the houses down, they found tunnels. In fact, Rutherford Kelker's house at that time was the site of Dauphin County Historical Society. They tore the houses down and they found tunnels running under the houses, under Front Street to the river. So our teacher, and I forget who my 5th grade teacher was, unfortunately, she told us, said, we're not studying Civil War now, but go down and look at this. So I went down and saw this. And I have a copy of the newspaper clipping that shows the pictures of the tunnels. But now this is 1941. we're in World War II. They wanted to get their houses torn down. So all they did was cover it up and built the courthouse. But these were sites. That was my first introduction to something about Underground Railroad, because we know that Kelker and Rutherford were very involved in the Underground Railroad. About 2 weeks ago, when I was in Dauphin County Historical Society with Ken Frew, Norman Kelker was there. Norman Kelker is the grandson of Rudolph Kelker, and he comes to Harrisburg probably twice a year doing research on his uncle. His great-grandfather, sorry, his great-grandfather. So he gave me a printout, most of the information I knew, but he gave me a little printout about his grandfather. And some pictures, some things which I'll discuss in a minute. Now, back to the people that George H Imes named. Agnes Crane. Agnes Crane was Dr. William Rutherford's sister-in-law. And when William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, I think most of you know this because you're historians. When Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison came to Harrisburg in 1847, sorry. Dr. Rutherford and Agnes Crane met them at the station. And Agnes Crane, Dr. Rutherford, William Lloyd Garrison stayed with William Rutherford, and Frederick Douglass stayed with John Wolfe, who's another one of the 100 names and was a Harrisburg teacher. And most of you, have you seen this historic marker on Walnut Street? There's a historic marker for Underground Railroad. It's on the Capitol grounds. It's between 4th Street and Aberdeen. Between 5th Street and Aberdeen. 4th and Aberdeen. It's a historic marker for the Underground Railroad, and it mentions that Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison came to Harrisburg in 1847, spoke at the courthouse, the old courthouse, and when Douglass spoke, he threw rotten tomatoes, and garbage at him, and he later spoke at Wesley AME Church, and they talked a little bit about the Underground Railroad, and then it mentions on that same, how many have seen that? Okay, a few. This is something local and something that you should go see because you should read this off. Joseph Bustill is mentioned. Now, Joseph Bustill was a teacher in the Harrisburg school system from 1852 to 1962. And he was Underground Railroad. Also mentioned on there is Dr. Pap Jones that we mentioned. Anybody ever heard of Dr. Pap Jones?
I heard it.
Okay, so I'll tell you about each one of these people. All right, let's go. All right, here we go. All right. Here we go. Let's get some notes here. Because these are important people that we should know more about if you don't. Okay. All right, let's take Bustill first. All right. Bustill was born to a famous family in Philadelphia in 1822, and he was a descendant of Indian Quakers. He taught school in Harrisburg, like I said, from 1852 to 1962, and we have letters, copies of letters between Joseph Bustill and William Still. Now, most of you have heard of William Still in the Underground Railroad. He wrote a book on the Underground Railroad. So we have copies of that, where they talk about transporting slaves from one place to another, from Reading to Harrisburg. Joseph Bustill was educated in the best of schools. He was a polished writer and convincing speaker, and was the youngest member of the Underground Railroad, being only 17 when he started. He did yeoman service until the passage of the 15th Amendment. And the writer of this article, who is his daughter, mentions that she often heard him say that he helped over 1,000 fugitive slaves to safety. That's a big number. So I saw 1,000 slaves. So I said, well, I wonder, what's an estimate? What's the estimate for the number of slaves, fugitive slaves that we had? How many is an estimate? Does anybody ever hear of an estimate? So I went online, and it's estimated that 100,000 African Americans escaped from slavery on the Underground Railroad. Now, where that figure comes from, I don't know. But even more interesting is that in today's dollars, each slave would be worth 500 then, but in today's dollars, that would be 23,000. So if you multiply that, that means the slaves that escaped have a value of something like $230 million. A lot of money, a lot of money. All right, back to Joseph Bustill in Harrisburg. Okay. While teaching school, it said that a kindly justice of the peace used to keep him informed as to the haunted ones. And he used private homes, churches, lodges, and halls in the 8th Ward to move his slaves to the Underground Railroad. As a school teacher, but he also taught Sunday school on Sunday as in a Presbyterian church. Joseph Bustill was a very famous person. His cousin, David Bustill Bowser, was the artist that drew the flags for 7 USCT regiments out of William Penn. And we have pictures of those flags. You've seen the flags, and as Linwood Sloan will tell you, the flags depict an African-American Civil War soldier and Miss Liberty portrayed by a white woman on these flags. You've probably seen those. So this is part of the Bustill family. Now another one of these teachers is one of my favorites that no one's ever heard of hardly, is Agnes Kemp. Anybody ever heard of Agnes Kemp? No. Nobody's heard of Agnes Kemp. And I first saw her name, along with being Sunday mission with a George Imes article, in 1870 when they celebrated the passage of the 15th Amendment, and they mentioned people that spoke at the parade and the ceremony. They mentioned Mrs. Agnes Kemp spoke. So I was curious, who was Agnes Kemp? All right. Agnes Kemp was the son of Antone Nenninger. In Harrisburg, did anybody hear of Antone Street? No? Okay. It's uptown, yes. Antone Street is above Division. And her father, Antone Nenninger, came here from France in 1816. And he had been a member of Napoleon's army. And he owned all the land from Front Street to where the railroad, Wildwood Park, is now. And his daughter was named Agnes Nenninger. And also there's Antone Street up there named, this is called Nenninger Town. And Antone Nenninger, there's a street named for him, Antone. There's an alley, Kemp Alley, if you Google the name for Agnes Kemp. And Marie Alley is named for her daughter. Well, Agnes Kemp, Agnes Nenninger Kemp, was very famous as the abolitionist and suffragette speaker. And she toured with Emerson, Sojourner Truth, later with Susan B. Anthony and Francis Harper, all the greats in the suffragette movement and the underground, the abolitionists. And yet, hardly anyone's heard of Agnes Kemp in Harrisburg. A few years ago, when I was on the board of the Dauphin County Historical Society, I found a book written on her, and we actually had a tea and we had someone come in as a reenactor and portray her. Because among the other things she did, she, owning all this land, in later years, she gave Wildwood Park to the city of Harrisburg. And she had a caveat in there that the park, it only could be used for park or education. And somehow, my friend Mayor Reed saw this, and that's how he decided that he could legally give Hack the right to build the Hack College on the Wildwood campus, because of the caveat that it could be used for education. Agnes Kemp died in sophomore in 1908. At the age of 59, in 1879, she decided to go to medical school. Actually, she graduated from the medical school, women's medical school in Philadelphia in 1879, and she became Dauphin County's first female physician. And she was also the first female to be admitted to the Dauphin County Historical Society. So that's why we honored her so much down there. But she taught school, the Sunday school, so we have our young African American youth going to Sunday school and listening to some of these teachers. Now, what did the teachers tell them other than Sunday school about the Bible? Chances are they told them so many other things about life, so many other things about the history of Harrisburg, the history of showing them the things that African Americans had done in Harrisburg that's so famous. So that's part of my connection to the Underground Railroad and the Sunday school. Now, one of the names mentioned was Joseph Bustill. Have any of you heard the 1850 riot in Harrisburg? Well, 1850 was the year that the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. But slightly before it was passed, I think in September. But Harrisburg has sometimes we tend to be, we can be the first with anything. So Harrisburg has a famous riot that started on the eve of the Fugitive Slave Act about fugitive slaves. And this riot happened in 1850. Richard McAllister had been appointed a U.S. Commissioner under the Act of 1850. Have you ever heard of McAllister? I know some of you have. McAllister is a slave commissioner. So if a slave is going to be captured and sent back into slavery, he has to be taken before a commissioner, and you have some sort of a kangaroo court before you do this. Well, Joseph B. Pope, was an athletic man, and when these slaves were in the courthouse, he felled one of the U.S. Marshals. Now, some of the slave catchers were U.S. Marshals. Did you know that?
I didn't know they were.
Nobody knew that.
No.
Yeah. Well, first of all, slave catching, I mentioned the value of the slaves. So, to catch slaves, I mean, people were rewarded for catching slaves, but also U.S. Marshals. I'm just thinking, correct me if I'm wrong, just recently there was a U.S. Marshal killed in Harrisburg about 2 or 3 years ago. See, my son is a county detective. Now, there was a U.S. Marshal killed accidentally doing something in Harrisburg about 2 or 3 years ago. Was it? Yes. Now, didn't they mention that was the first U.S. Marshal killed in Pennsylvania since the Civil War? Or since fugitive slave law? There's something about that. And that's a little off track here, but I just happened to think about that. So, some of the slave catchers were U.S. Marshals because they had authority to arrest people. Well, this is where Joseph Bustill comes in. So he fells one of the U.S. Marshals, and he's bloody. One of the fugitive, a slave escaped, and he ran up the boardwalk through the Capitol grounds. Never knew that existed. So he reached the thickets, and then he turned north and was never recaptured. Now, Rudolph Kelker witnessed this. So Rudolph Kelker says, he tells the people later, how did this situation look at this jailhouse when they had the riot? Horrible was the reply. The floor and walls of the jail busted you were plentiful, besprinkled with blood. Did you see the whole of the fight? I asked Cassius Brown, who at that time was a lad of 6 or 7 years old, was attending Sunday school. His father's residence being on Walnut Street opposite jail. Yes, was Cassius Brown's reply. The ferocity of fighting was beyond the power of words to describe. The balcony of the exchange building was crowded with colored men who showered down stones on the heads of the officers. The militia was ordered out, and the rioters, and a cannon was brought from the arsenal. Now you know that the arsenal that's now at 18th and Hurst Street was on the Capitol grounds.
Yeah.
Okay. At first I wanted to do a PowerPoint and I wasn't able to get it together, but believe me, in fact there's a famous 1850 picture, art portrait, that shows the arsenal of Harrisburg, located on the state arsenal located on the Capitol grounds, south of the old Capitol building, probably along where the old museum was. And that's going to come up again a little bit about this arsenal. So Cassius Brown said his mother was so excited for the safety of her children that she moved them away. Commissioner McAllister rendered himself so unpopular by his act and forcing the fugitive slave law that sometime later he left Harrisburg and never returned. Now, also prominent among the Harrisburg abolitionists of that period was Judge Mordecai Mckinney, and I mentioned him, a brilliant member of the bar, and Dr. William B. Rutherford, an able medical practitioner. So pronounced were Dr. Rutherford's sentiments in his opposition to slavery that he was subject to much persecution and consequence. The principal station of the Underground Railroad in Harrisburg for him was a frame building on River Avenue near Barbara Avenue. Now, do you know where Barbara Street is?
No.
Okay. I know you all know where McNeese Wallison Building is on Front Street. It's a red light there. Well, Barbara is a little alley running off of Front towards Cranberry. Cranberry runs one block off of Front, parallel to Front. Well, there was a, what is it called, a barn that was one of the major places where slaves were kept and moved on by Dr. Rutherford. Now, Dr. Jones, Pap Jones, who was a king, they called him the king, mayor, and chief advisors of colored citizens of that period, was also involved in the settlement at 3rd and Mulberry Street. There was a narrow space between the house in which Jones lived and the adjoining ones where fugitives were secreted in case of a search. The admission being gained to the building by a movable board was apparently formed in place. Now, a large portion of the colored men who sought freedom by flight traveled singly or in pairs. And this is from Dr. Rutherford's writing. And this is sort of interesting because he's saying that usually the Underground Railroad harbored 3 or more slaves, groups of slaves. Several slaves following the North Star would follow their own way to freedom. One of the routes from western Maryland and eastern Virginia lie through the Paxton Valley, where dwelt a settlement of abolitionists, prominent among whom for many years was William Rutherford, the philanthropist. who for over 50 years shuttered and assisted every poor slave who knocked at his door. His house was the principal station in the valley, stood about a quarter of a mile north of the Turnpike Road, and was connected there with by a private lane at the mouth of which, and near the center of the highway, stood until 1859 a large locust tree, the peculiarity of which was its being the only tree of its kind that grew in the road between Harrisburg and Hummelstown. So this was the idea. The slave, it was therefore served as an unmistakable guidepost to Mr. Rutherford's house. Now this is the house that he had in this area. As I mentioned before, the house that he had on Front Street was at 9 South. And I had just a little blurb on this. When John Brown was, there's a book I looked at, John Brown's Men. When John Brown was captured at Harper's Ferry, there was a meeting at Dr. Rutherford's house to see if it was feasible to attempt to rescue John Brown and put him on the pathway to escape through the Underground Railroad. That's well documented because Higginson was there and some other prominent abolitionists. But it was decided that John Brown was too well guarded at Harper's Ferry, so it was scratched. But it shows you how powerful the Underground Railroad was and what they thought they could do. Now getting back to it, about Mr. Rutherford's house, it served unmistakable guide and many a forlorn and weary fugitive upon reaching that old tree, thank God, and took heart again. During the summer and fall months, it used to betray men of their own color. I'm not sure what that means. This chapter, incomparable to this, would still be more if we failed to pay a tribute to memory of William Jones of Harrisburg. And William Jones is better known as Pap Jones. He actually became a physician. William Jones was born in Luzerne County in 1897. And in 1822, he came down the river in an ark with his wife and a load of coal. That's the first I've heard of people using. I think people use the river, but ark is probably a good boat to come down in because they can go through the rapids and so forth. So he came to Harrisburg and he sold the coal, and then he went to work at a drugstore, and he learned the Peruvian method of medicine. And I looked this up, and this is some sort of like an herbal doctor would be today. But he was recognized as a physician, and he's listed, if you ever read Laverty's History of Medicine in Dauphin County, where he lists all the doctors that practiced medicine in Dauphin County. Pap Jones is mentioned. In fact, there are 3 black Dr. Joneses that practice medicine in Dauphin County. And this first one is Pap Jones. The second was Dr. William Jones, who's on that 100 list that I mentioned, and who was involved in the Old Eighth Ward and was with the City Beautiful movement and so forth. Another popular man who died in 1905. He was the most popular African American in Harrisburg at that time. He fell on the Capitol grounds, the new Capitol, and developed pneumonia and died at the age of 42 in 1905. And the third Dr. Jones, I know a lot of you know him because he's the one from Steelton, and he's the one that graduated from Harrisburg Tech, and he lived probably to the 1980s. So there are 3 famous African American Dr. Joneses in Harrisburg. But Pap Jones, the one in the Underground Railroad, was a large, well-built man of pure African descent. Like I said, he came down in this ark. And they said he had a quality known among colored people as coon sense, which being interpreted means genius with a large share of cunning superseded. For many years, Mr. Jones was one of the most efficient men conducted the Underground Railroad in this locality. He had acquired a thorough knowledge of the routes leading northward and was always prepared to furnish competent guides. His large covered wagon, drawn by 2 horses and driven by himself, in the capacity of a rag merchant, was frequently to be met on the roads leading toward Wilkes-Barre and Pottsville. And I know that one of the next stops on the Underground Railroad going out of Harrisburg, especially, was Pottsville, because that's been documented. And then at the bottom of this article is one of these clippings by Mrs. Ingram and the initials WFR. At this point, I'm going to wonder if there's any questions somebody might have, because I like to get questions about some of the things I've said or some of the things you were wondering about at the Sunday school and the Underground Railroad. Yes?
I have a question. I don't know if these tunnels were related to the Underground Railroad, but as I recall, the young man, downtown used to have underground tunnels where you could go down and go
Yes.
to the bathroom,
To a
to
square.
shoe shine, and there used to be a tunnel that would go in the Capitol complex, I believe where the South Office building is, right now, over to where Strawberry Square is at.
I've heard some of that. In fact, I understand, I mentioned when they tore down for the courthouse, but I understand when they tore down for the Hilton, they found some things like that.
Yeah, I
It was right there on the
true.
corner.
Is that right?
It was right there on that
Where
corner.
Kaplan's used to be.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. When they tore those down, you found some interesting things.
Yeah.
But now, there were I remember there were comfort rooms, which were underground restrooms on Market Square,
Right.
on the north and south side of Market Street. One for the women and one for men.
Right.
And you see, there's some
Oh, yeah, right there.
and they had shoe shines, very clean. It was a comfort station for a restroom. It was toilets.
Right in the corner.
One for men and one for women.
Yeah.
And you went down steps, and you could also get shoe shine down there, and coach brushed off and things like that.
But some of those tunnels that were like over near the South Office building that connected with where Strawberry Square is now, and where Hilton is now, or kind of close where the Jackson House is at as well. I wonder if that could have been related at all. Because I think the Jackson House used to be involved in that.
Well, Jackson House is on 6th Street.
Well, that's not too far from.
Well, I'm not sure. You could be, but I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
No,
That's pretty far up. See, we have a couple of people that lived in those neighborhoods, and I don't know if tunnels went that far. In fact, you see, in Harrisburg really ended at North Street up until 1860, and I have a map of the Broad Street Market. When Verbeck built the Broad Street Market, the idea was to put the market there first, and then the people would build around it. And there are maps that show North Street, and then nothing about this. So you can see Verbeck Street, which is named for William Verbeck, or Broad Street, and you see the old stone market, and then that area developed around there. In fact, that's an area that a lot of African Americans moved into, and the streets around there, Marion and William and Margaret
And James.
there you go, were the daughters and sons of William Burbank.
Yeah, families.
And it's interesting you mention that, because that's the old 6th Ward. When they did the wards, the first Harrisburg had north, south, east, and west wards. And then in 1860, when they were incorporated, then they started to name the wards. And the 8th Ward became a popular one, and they tore down part of the old 8th Ward. But the wards basically were named up, they had 10 wards, 1 through 10, when they were first named. Any other?
One other quick
Yes.
question. I know some of those churches downtown there, Market Square, some of those larger churches, from what I understand, may have been involved with the underground?
Yes, in fact,
Oh, yeah.
let's mention that, because this clipping, when William Imes George Imes is talking about the Sunday school and he mentioned the Presbyterians. The African Americans had basically worshiped at the Market Square Presbyterian and the Pine Street Presbyterian churches. But then they wanted to form their own church. So the first one was called the Second Presbyterian Church. And he mentions that. That's part of the Sunday school. And then they built a church on Elder Street. And they changed the name to the Elder Street Presbyterian Church. Now, Elder Street is the same street as Capitol Street. And when the name was changed to Capitol Street, the church changed its name again to Capitol Street Presbyterian. And even though they're out on the hill now, they still kept the name. When they moved the last time, they still kept the name Capitol Presbyterian Church. But that's the church that basically Imes is talking about. Now, Mordecai Mckinney was the superintendent of the Sunday school. Now, he was a lawyer, and he was the superintendent of the Second Presbyterian Church from 1852 till he died in 1867. And unfortunately, he died. He was hit by a horse and buggy on Market Street in 1867, and he was killed. But he was very involved with the Underground Railroad and also with the church because he was superintendent of the Sunday school. Anything else? Yes?
Caleb, I have a question about the riot in 1850 that you mentioned.
Yes.
How many dead, injured, and escaped as a result of that riot? Do you have any estimates?
I think there were 3 or 4 people killed. Probably 4 or 5 escapes. And there's another document, and what's interesting, now the one article I read here was by some written years later, but one that I have reference to that I haven't seen is this Joseph Bustill. His granddaughter was Esther Shaw, who was the first African-American female to graduate from Dickinson in 1919. And she later wrote an article about her grandfather, and it's called The Fragrant Defiance of the Fugitive Slave Law. And then there she tells part of the story about this riot that her grandfather was involved in. And she cites that it was the fact it was like a month before the Fugitive Slave Law was in the process, but it wasn't really signed. But as far as a definite number of people that were injured, I can't give you that. But it's described of how bloody the courthouse was. Some other things. Esther Shaw is another outstanding woman from Harrisburg. Like I said, she was the first. She graduated Harrisburg High in 1915. She graduated from Dickinson in 1919. And I was fortunate about 5 years ago, since I was involved, I went to Dickinson to do research on her. Dickinson gave her an honorary doctorate, posthumous doctorate, about 5 years ago, because of what she had endured at Dickinson. When she went to Dickinson, she was not allowed to stay on campus. She had to commute. But they recognized her as being the first African American. And some of she had a daughter that is still living. Her daughter married a Norwegian. Her daughter is still living in Norwegian. Her daughter didn't come, but some of her grandchildren came from Norway to that ceremony. And that was at Dickinson about 5 years ago. And they now have a special room on Dickinson College named for Esther Shaw. Any other questions about anything? It doesn't have to be about this, anything. Yes?
You gave a number on the for the individuals who William Steele was credited with helping.
They're saying...
How did that correlate to the stories that he wrote down as depicted in the movie Harriet?
They're saying that they rescued maybe 1,000 slaves. And I read William Steele's book. It doesn't seem like he comes up with a number that large. Well, he probably didn't record everything. Basically, he's talking about the methods that they used in the Underground Railroad, how they secreted people. He talks about the people involved. but he never gives a number that approaches 1,000. 1,000 is a big number. And I'm not saying that it's not true, but that's a big number. Yes?
You're indicating there were a number of underground tunnels. Was there a master designer for that?
That we
And
don't see.
who-
What they
and
found
who-
is this
Who
is
dug them?
August of 1941. And World War II is on. A lot's happening in this country. And you're right. There must have been some design to it because you just don't do tunnels in the blind. You know, there's got to be some. Well, we'll never know because it was filled in. Yeah, no, I wouldn't say we'll never know because we continue to find out new things.
There's still tunnels out there.
Through clippings, through diaries, through, I won't say we'll never know, because we continue to find new information. But at this point, I don't know if anyone that does know anything about these master tunnels, which apparently were in Market Square and in the market area and Front Street. Yes,
The Jackson House was mentioned a few moments ago.
yes,
Did that play any role, or did that vicinity play any role in the Underground
no.
Railroad?
Like I said, Harrisburg ended at North Street up until in the 1860s. And that area played nothing in the underground. I know Ken Frew often says people were talking about there was a house in the Chester family. There's a house on Baum Street that some of the Chester family had. And I think James Otter was the last to live there. And it was some story was that they were involved in the Underground Railroad. And you know, Ken Frew, some of these historians, well, those homes weren't built until the early 1900s. So no way it's Underground Railroad. Some things are facts, and a lot is fiction, and we sort of have to separate that. Yes.
I know they talk about the Underground Railroad and how important it is, but an operation like that is so secret
Yes.
and not being done. Well, I think a lot wasn't left. And what happens though, years later, an operation like that becomes popular or part of the national feel-good. I say feel-good, that may be the word I want to use. It reminds me of a Dutch professor I met when I was at Antietam. Who was over here, and one of the things he was doing was looking at the Underground Railroad in the United States prior to the Civil War. And what he found, and how little real detail, not detail, evidence behind
Yes.
these things happen. And he compared it to the fact that if all the stories of the resistance in Holland were true, that we were put out today,
Yes.
the Nazis would not have been able to eat in World War II. And the other thing was, when I was in England, and there was a time in which the Protestant Reformation and the Church of England and persecution of the priests and the Catholics, and they went out to hide, that was true, people knew that. But it had become a point of pride of anybody in England who had a home, maybe from that era, who found a small closet or something behind the wall
Yes.
that was, you know, not even necessarily being there for a person to be in,
Yes.
to claim that was a priesthood.
Yes.
Because they were on the good side. And not many years ago, down in Middletown, across the street from my brother, who lived at 246 Ann Street, a building was torn down, and when they tore it down, they found these holes going back into the ground. And immediately, people started talking about the fact that it was a part of the Underground Railroad. And in fact, my sister-in-law's neighbor, Miss Ada, who had died many years ago, lived in front of us, had talked about the legend was of all these holes and all these places in Middletown for the Underground Railroad. And they could find no evidence of it. In fact, some of it they find were used as, at least later, as speakeasies in 1920s. And it's not
Yes,
the fact that
yes.
they don't exist, it's the
Yes.
fact that it's hard to find evidence to nail this down
Right.
because of the fact of, you don't want to nail it down, because you don't want to leave evidence that you were involved
want to write
in
down
the
that you
danger.
meant.
And so, you know, and like I said, I think there's a tendency that
That's the problem.
you find a hole,
Prove it.
that's all, find a hole in the ground or find something like that, Obviously, it was the Underground Railroad. And you don't know because there was no evidence left along the way.
Yes.
It's nice to think about it, it's nice to believe.
You're correct. It seems like in the 1880s, people started writing about the Underground Railroad. They said, well, I did this and this happened and so forth. Because this article by William Rutherford is in the 1880s. The clipping from George Imes is in the 1880s. 1880s, they started looking back. Usually it takes people going back 20 or 30 years is when people like to start talking about what happened. And then it's very vague as to what happened. And as William Rutherford said, Underground Railroad was illegal.
Yeah.
This is illegal activity, and you could be caught, if you were caught aiding and abetting slaves and escaping, you could be fined and sent to prison. And there were people that were fined. There were some people in Boiling Springs, in Cooper Wainwright's book, he mentions especially some of the men in Boiling Springs in Cumberland County that were caught helping fugitive slaves, and they were sentenced
Well, in
and
Christiana,
lost their home. They lost their homes.
well, in Christiana,
Yes.
in Lancaster County, of course,
Yeah.
the riots there had happened. I mean,
Riot, yeah.
and we know a few things like that. But that is, what don't we know, and what was conveniently forgotten for the reason.
Yes.
One thing I wanted to say is, I think a lot of times people think nowadays that everybody in Pennsylvania was of one mind. And they weren't. There were differences of opinion about slavery and everything else. Also, people don't understand how long slavery existed in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And that we had, part of the problem with the Fugitive Slave Act was that we had gradual manumission.
Yes.
Slavery didn't just end, it was gradual.
Well, and even during the Civil War, and we think, the North is anti-slavery and equal rights, that.
Right.
Little was known, I came across information about that in 1860, must have been early 1862, there was a riot at the enlistment office here in Harrisburg when word had gotten out and rumors had gotten out about we're going to enlist blacks into the Union Army and this stuff, and people came. First, and after was a number of blacks came to enlist. The Army wasn't allowed to do it, and they were, and that created unrest. And then there were whites who rose up to fight the blacks. In fact, the U.S. Army sent in troops to put down the riots.
Right at Camp Curtin.
Well, those in Camp Curtin, downtown Harrisburg.
Yeah.
And so we forget things like that because that's politically incorrect. We forget part of our history because of that.
Yeah.
You're correct. By the way, Wayne Motz is not here today because he told me he has to go to a family reunion. So, but I told Wayne, I said, I just found pictures that Dave Kleinpeter, you know Dave Kleinpeter?
Yeah.
Well, he's the man that dresses up as Governor Curtin. Well, about 20 years ago or so, he gave me some pictures that he said were the pictures of Eaton Slaughter's funeral. So I said, well, I'm going to bring those today. So Wayne said, thanks, we already have those. And I said, okay. So I brought them, and I don't know if these are the same one Wayne has. He says, well, maybe yours are clearer, and we can. So I brought those along today, and I was going to give them to the Civil War Museum.
Right.
In fact, we were going to lock them up. I said, no, I want the family to see these first to see if these are the same ones. And I have the letter that Dave Kleinpeter gave me, because Dave Kleinpeter was in the Sons of Union Veterans,
Right.
and he was at the funeral.
Right.
So I have those today.
Caleb,
Yes.
his shell casings are in the display.
I know the shell casings are in there.
Those are his.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the only thing, when I looked at the pictures again today, and there's a puzzle. Now, Eaton Slaughter died in February of 1943. And the people standing outside the church are wearing shorts. And usually you don't wear shorts in February. So anyway, I'm here for you to say.
What, I had a question. Is Dr. Rutherford a man of color or white? You referred to Dr. Rutherford.
Oh, he's white.
His way.
No, I just was, yeah.
And I understand, as I
I
made the
just was
presentation, I said, well, some people, since I'm an African-American that does research, everybody I talk about is not African-American, because we have to get involved in history as it is. And I wasn't sure I was going to present that. I should say, well, unless I say otherwise, they're African-American. But that's a good question, because what I found in this history of Sunday school, and it was interdenominational and interracial. Looks like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, and the Methodist Zions were involved, that we know, they're mentioned. And the people are obviously Bustill, Pap Jones, Cassius Brown are black, Agnes Kemp, Agnes Crane, Rutherford, Joseph Mordecai are white. And it's obvious that this is what it is.
You have a neighbor next door to me whose name is Rutherford, and this is what I'm asking him when I get home. I'm going to ask her, that's somebody in her family way back.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Very interesting.
Now, one of the things I mentioned about,
Yeah.
one of the things that happens at the Historical Society, when people start doing their research, this can be very interesting. When they come to Harrisburg, they come to Dauphin County, and usually go to Dauphin County Historical Society. So if somebody of interest shows up, Ken Frew will call me. Now, about 5 years ago, Ken Frew called me and he says, there's a man here by the name of Brian Woodson researching Catherine McClintock. And he also says that he's a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings.
Could be.
So I said, Ken,
Could be.
train this guy, hold this guy till I get there. So I get down to the Historical Society, and sure enough, Brian Woodson. And he's the one that wrote a book about being a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And his DNA was, but he was in Harrisburg because on this one side of the family, he's Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. But the other side of the family, he was related to Catherine McClintock, Marshal. And what we found out is that Catherine McClintock, that was her second marriage. She had been married before, and she was indeed his great-great-grandmother. And at that particular time, I was able to get into Lincoln Cemetery. He was here, and then when he told me he graduated from Lincoln University, where I went to school, I said, well, Byron, I said, he's over here one day, I said, I got to get you into Lincoln. So I called Ella, who was still living then, and she came out and met us, and we got into Lincoln and got to see the graves. So these people occasionally come. Also, 2 years ago, a descendant of Cassius Brown. Now, we talked about Cassius Brown. Cassius Brown. Cassius Brown is very well known. One of the things we found about him recently, during the Civil War, during the Battle of Gettysburg, when we know that Thomas Morris Chester and Andrew Bradley had 2 brigades of African Americans ready to fight. They went over and dug trenches in the West Shore. Cassius Brown was interviewed in 1913 by J. Howard Wirt, and he was one of the ones that was involved in this. It's the first time we actually had first-hand account, and I have a copy, I don't have it with me, I have a copy of his interview. And he mentions that they were sort of drafted, recruited, or pushed into it, whatever you call it, and he said they got uniforms from the state arsenal that was still on the Capitol grounds. And he said it was a mixed bag of, said they had Navy hats and this shirt, they didn't match up, but he had some sort of uniforms. And this is where the weapons came from, the arsenal. And said, and they were armed. He was in Andrew Bradley's brigade. And in fact, he said he never got paid for this. The Army never recognized them as being, they were only involved for about a week. And they didn't shoot anybody. They dug trenches on the West Shore, but they were there. If Lee's army would have reached Harrisburg, they would have been involved. And he said he was never paid for that time, or never even recognized for being in the service. Now, Cassius Brown's brother, about 15 years ago, I got information, there was a Crafton Tyler Brown, a very famous artist. That was the brother. He was born in Harrisburg, 1842. He was the brother of Cassius Brown, and he was an artist, a lithographer. He went west, and at the Weaver Museum in Baltimore, at the Walters Museum in Baltimore, they were having an exhibit of his paintings and drawings, so I went down to the exhibit. And they had pictures of his drawings, copies of some of his pictures. He did the lithograph for Wells Fargo and for Levi Strauss. So some of your Levi's, he was involved in that with Levi Strauss's belts and pants, the Wells Fargo. In fact, they were the ones that paid for the exhibit. And this is a famous black artist from Harrisburg that nobody hardly knew about. The only person that ever mentioned it was, if you remember, Undertaker Horatio Lethbridge. His wife was related to Crafton Brown, and she had told me about him. Sometimes when I talk to, at my age, when I talk to some of the older people, they'd give me some clues here and there of relationships that Harrisburg had in the past to very famous people. And if you Google Crafton Tyler Brown, in fact, from that I named my grandson Tyler Jackson. But Tyler, Crafton Tyler Brown, you'll be able to pull up some of his drawings, illustrations, maps, and so forth. Anything else I might help you with? If not, the time's out, so I hope you enjoyed. And anytime you want to contact me about anything, I'm available. Yes?